Do you want to get the best possible photos and video from the camera on your smartphone? If so, then patience you must have if you want to learn the art of photography, my young padawan. This is Media Channels, a multimedia corp production, bringing you information about the latest media trends, helpful tutorials, and commentary on the digital world around you. Thank you for joining me for part 1 of how to use your smartphone camera for better photos and video. My name is Stuart Rathtree over at Multimedia Corp. In this episode, I will touch on the basics of composing a better photo, and in part 2, I will focus on how to shoot cell phone video, and in part 3, I will provide practical examples of these tips in practice. One misconception that people have is that cell phone photos are not up to the task of taking good photos or video. I beg to disagree. This is only partially true, but at times you can get stunning cell phone shots as well. Using your tools to their potential and being creative will have a bigger impact on capturing a great cell phone photo. However, cell phones do have 2 weaknesses that I'm going to explain. The first being is the small sensor size. A sensor is basically a silicon wafer with millions of tiny pixels or dots on it, and when light hits one of those pixels, a light-sensitive element measures the light intensity. Now, cell phone sensors are relatively small in comparison to DSLRs, and it's to help keep it mobile, and because of this, the light gathering capabilities are not very good. Without enough light, you will tend to get blurring, ghosting, or other noisy artifacts in your shots. Now, if you do find yourself in a low light situation, the best thing you can do is find more light. So, with that in mind, try standing under a lamppost or other brighter area, turn on the cell phone light, or use whatever light you can find. And there was one particular situation that I was at a wedding, and the pro photographer was trying to shoot a photograph at night, and there wasn't much light around. It was out at a farm. And what ended up happening to resolve the situation is that the photographer rounded up 5 or 6 people and had them all turn on their cell phone lights to help light up the subject in the situation. So if you really want to take a photo in a low light situation, please keep the cell phone as steady as possible and keep the subject or scenery as steady as possible as well. I can't stress that enough. Now, low light and motion is a big enemy of the cell phone camera. If you don't stay steady, you will introduce ghosting into your image. And that's because of the automatic exposure setting on your cell phone. So keeping your smartphone steady is important in most situations, but in low light is even more troublesome. Now, to improve your steadiness in low light, you can try some of these tips that I came up with. Number 1 is take your photo in landscape mode. That is, what I mean by that is hold the phone sideways with your elbows pressed into your body like this, okay? This will help steady your shot by spreading out your arms, and it will also distribute the weight of the phone over a distance. Now, you will have to trust me that this technique actually does work. It is much the same as if you were trying to walk on a railway track. So imagine yourself walking a railway track and you're trying to balance yourself. It's the same thing. You're distributing your weight over a distance, okay? So the key is basically distributing your weight. So for professionals who do a lot of videography, they know about this as well and about balancing their camera on a tripod. Most professional tripods have what they call as counterweights in them. So when you set up your camera, you're trying to balance the camera on a center point, well, over here, center point, and this center point helps it so that it's not going back and forth. So if you're trying to go up and down with the camera, it won't just topple over. Okay, so it's the same. This technique can also be used in photography as well. Now, this may not be the ideal situation, however, is if you're trying to take a photo that is supposed to be in portrait mode, that is the vertical shot. Okay, so this can mean the difference between a usable shot and one that is simply too blurry to use or to keep. Okay, so if you get a blurry shot of it, I mean, you're probably not going to keep it. Number 2 is to find something to prop your cell phone onto. Now, I've done this in the past where it could be a glass, a dinner plate. I just kind of prop the cell phone against a plate and then tilt it enough so it doesn't fall over and take my photo. That keeps it nice and steady. Some cell phone cases have flaps built into them that they can stand up in a V shape. You can find a tree, a table, or even just get a piece of cardboard and fold it in the shape of a tent and then put your cell phone up against that. Maybe try a pole as well if you're outside. You could try put it on your knee. Sometimes I've done that, or put it on your elbow. Sometimes I put it on my elbow like this and then just sort of rested on my arm like that, just in case you couldn't hear me there. So try doing that to help keeping your cell phone steady. And number 3 is, if you want to get a bit fancier, you can also get a cell phone holder for about $10 Canadian, and it's actually a special holder that fits your phone, and then there's a little 1/4-inch nut on the bottom of it that you can use to mount to a tripod. And then just go buy any little flexible tripod for $10, $20 and just use that to keep your shot steady. Keep it nearby, keep it in your car, keep it wherever, in your backpack, and so on. The second weakness to cell phone cameras is that without jerry-rigging your phone with an external lens, you are pretty much stuck to one zoom setting. Well, you could use the digital zoom, but all you're really doing is cropping the photo. You're not really zooming in that situation. And as you already know, the quality decreases as you zoom in, and capturing a quality shot becomes harder as well because it's not as steady when you zoom in. So this isn't really a problem if you're taking photos or video of landscapes. As the scenery you're trying to take, you pretty much want to get the whole shot on the screen of the phone. There isn't really much you can do to improve the zoom situation other than getting closer to the subject. So if you have to get closer, get closer. That's the best way to zoom in on a cell phone. Now, those are the 2 weaknesses I wanted to point out. What I'm going to do now is give you some tips on how to improve the composition of the photo itself. So those were more practical. These ones are going to be more about the composition of the photo. So the number 1 thing that I will emphasize over everything else is to remember that your photograph or video is telling a story. It is also explaining a situation, and it is capturing a setting. Okay, so keep this in mind when you are snapping your next photo. I have made a list, and tip number 1 in this list is landscape versus portrait mode. So this is the first thing you should consider when taking a photo. I mean, it has to be. Determine if you want to take a portrait or a landscape shot. So the purpose of a portrait or vertical shot is to isolate and take pictures of isolated people or very tall objects like trees or buildings. Now that's the primary purpose of the portrait shot. The focus is the subject or the object, hence why it is called a portrait. Now the background is secondary in this type of shot, but it is still helpful in telling the viewer more about what is going on in the scene. Okay? Unless you're in a studio, then you probably just have a background that you want to look nice. As for landscape mode, or also called horizontal mode, it is best suited when you wish to take photographs of scenery, groups of people, cities, or if you desire to take a portrait but want to include more of the background behind the subject. All right. So if you're going to go take a picture of the lake, or going up on top of Mount McKay, if you're in Thunder Bay, you know where Mount McKay is. This is where you would want landscape mode. Okay. So figuring out this basic step and how to hold the phone correctly will improve your shots immediately. Okay. So whether you want to hold it this way, or if you want to hold it again. So this is landscape mode here. Okay. And this is portrait mode. You can see that. Okay. Tip number 2 is the rule of thirds. It's been around for a long time. Most cell phones have a setting actually that allows for grid mode, okay, which is basically the rule of thirds. This guideline has been around since 1797 and is one technique out of many. Now let me stress this part. It's not the only technique to help compose a shot, but it is the most basic one, and for beginners this is what I recommend. And it will also help you in composing and thinking about framing your image. So when you go to frame your shot, imagine that the photo is divided into 9 equal parts in a grid-like fashion. Now the intersects where the lines cross, I should say, helps give the eye something more dynamic to look at. Now this is one technique to create interest within the photograph. All right. So positioning the person or the landscape along or at their intersecting lines helps balance the photo and is just generally more interesting. That is to say that you can't center somebody up in the shot, but this will also generate interest as well. You should, however, keep in mind that having too much white space or empty space on one side of the photograph or in the background will actually be very distracting as well. So don't just blindly put it on one of the intersects and just say, oh, it's going to be a great photo. No, if there's nothing on the other side, then it's going to be a very boring photo. You're basically just making it look a little awkward in that situation. So, for instance, you could try taking a scenery shot of the horizon on a lake, line up the grid to the top 2/3 of the viewer on the cell phone. Another example is if you are taking a photo of a person, leave some extra space at the top of their head in the upper part of the photo, unless you're going for a very specific look, like a close-up. Now, for close-ups, you're not going to want to do that all the time, but in certain situations, it's good. A third example is this, is if you, in practice, take up a close-up of someone's face and use the grid to focus on something that you think is important. So it could be the subject's eyes, could be their lapel, or you could even line up on one of the intersecting lines on an interesting hat they might be wearing. Tip number 3, natural lighting. Okay, use it to your advantage. Okay, so generally in photography and video, the more light is better, but only if it is evenly lit. So if you have a very bright subject and the background is dull, or if the background is very bright and the subject is very dull or unlit, then that's not to your advantage at all. So in that situation, more light is not better. So you want to try to even out the light. So some things you can do to help this situation is, if the sun is shining in the face, simply turn them around so it's not shining in their face, so it's coming from the back. Try going under a tree, near a fence. Use a building, the shade of a building. Maybe there's a cloud that's going to be rolling in. Use that as shade. Now, you can't always do that, but if it's there, use it. If that doesn't work, again, just try to move around the sun so it's not shooting directly on someone's face or on the side of the subject. Some other things you maybe should be aware of is try to avoid shooting at midday bright sunlight. Now, the best hours for portrait photography are usually in the morning and just before dusk, when the sun is low on the horizon, but not too low that the scene starts to suffer from not having enough light to properly light up your photo. Tip number 4 is all about metering. So most cell phones, they have automatic metering settings in them and you don't have to worry about your shot at all. This can be an advantage, but it can also be a disadvantage. So metering in its most basic term means that the camera will expose the image based on a small box or point in the image. So exposure is how bright or how dark the image really is. So metering determines what area of the image should remain bright and what should remain dark. So if you have your cell phone, pressing your thumb on the screen or your finger on the screen will focus on that area, but it also acts as the metering point for the image. So if you did not know that, you do now. So it'll actually determine its metering based on where you put your finger. If you find that a part of the image you want to focus is either too dark or too bright, a simple trick is to simply tilt your phone left or right or up and down to see if you can get a better exposed image, or you could simply move away from any bright light sources. So this automatic metering mode can be helpful if you're new to taking photographs, but if your intention is to get the entire scene to have a more consistent brightness, you will have to find a way to do manual metering on your phone. On some phones, they actually have a feature called image stacking. I know my particular phone doesn't. Some apps you can download will have image stacking to kind of fake the evenness or the brightness of the image and increase the dynamic range of the photo. Most smartphones, they don't have manual metering settings, but there are a few that do. I don't know them offhand. An app that I frequently use to actually get around this problem is it's a Android app called Camera FV-5, and it has many more controls than your typical smartphone, which include the various metering modes. Some of the typical settings, it also has a lot of the settings that a DSLR includes as well. And the one that we're focusing on right now is spot metering, and that basically means that the image is exposed based on a tiny area of the focus region. Centering metering uses the center of the image or a small box to determine the exposure. And lastly, matrix metering, there's other names for it as well, uses the overall scene to determine the exposure. To see how this works, one test you can simply try is to point your phone up at a bright light such as the sun, a light fixture, or the moon if it's at night, and depending on the meter mode you will see how it changes the image. So if you point it up, it'll get brighter. If you point it down towards the ground where it's dark, it'll be dark until it tries to compensate for the brightness. Okay, so try that. As well as I've seen many photos of the full moon that were taken with cell phones, and unfortunately the result was simply a blob of white in the photo, and that's very unfortunate. I know they're trying to take a good photograph, but the cell phone just wasn't capable of doing the metering correctly. And for a lot of cell phones, there's no way around that. But if you were able to meter correctly, you could simply point your phone right at the point where the moon is, and if it was metering correctly, you could use spot metering to do it, and that would help. That would, in most cases, give you the correct brightness of the moon, and you would see a lot more details of the moon instead of just a bright blob. And that's assuming you can actually zoom in enough without degrading the image. Tip number 4 is using angles and different perspectives to create an interesting photo. Now, I remember when I first started playing around with my camera, I found myself experimenting a lot with pointing my camera at various things or objects and at different perspectives. I tried using the natural angles of what I was shooting to make an interesting image. So this could have been the natural lines of a structure, such as a building, an object that was close to the ground, such as a fire hydrant. I remember taking the pictures of partially hidden objects from the corner of a tree. I also remember taking photos from a high angle or a low angle, and from other perspectives that people would normally see at eye level. One thing you can try right away is to go outside and lay your cell phone in the grass and tip the phone slightly upward. This will create the interesting perspective if you were looking up at the world as a small animal. So you can go and try that, and you can see and experiment and see how creative you can be with that. Tip number 5 is background separation. Okay, so background separation, or bokeh, I believe is a Japanese word for blur, or what is also called the depth of field, is the blurry effect when you get a subject or when you get a subject or object is in focus and the background becomes blurry. Now, I was hesitant to include this because there are two divided camps on what makes a good photograph, and there have been many debates and vicious comments on various forums such as Reddit or other photography websites that have gotten out of hand. I am including it, however, because I feel that there are certain situations that background separation can make for a good photograph. I, however, tend to lean on the side that having blurry backgrounds is a crutch, and for most photographs does nothing to add to the overall quality of the photo. And I know that wedding photography has a major lust for creamy, silky backgrounds, and many photographers salivate like Pavlov's dog over a lens that can deliver razor-sharp focus on someone's nose. But really, what is the point of getting that razor-sharp focus on someone's eyelash, you know? In my opinion, it does not make for a professional photo, because I believe a big part of what makes a photo interesting is the scene itself, which is the background. And if you don't know what's happening around the subject, basically all you're doing is focusing on the subject itself. There's no context to the photo at all. So luckily for you, achieving the blurred background effect on a cell phone or a smartphone is a lot harder because of the super small sensor that's on a smartphone. But there are certain situations that you can actually achieve that effect. The easiest way to achieve the blurry background on a cell phone is to go super close to the subject or object and carefully focus on a part of the object, not the whole scene. When you do that, it actually will do background separation, at least most smartphones I've used anyways. So some good reasons why you may want to do background separation from the subject or object is because that the background could be otherwise overly distracting. If you got more going on in the background than what's going on in the foreground, then you probably want to do some blurring or background separation. There could also be too many competing colors in the photo. So if you find that there's too many bright colors in the background and the subject is very dull and wearing beige colored clothing, that would be another good use of that blurring effect. There may also be too much contrast. So if you find that the background has too much contrast, you may want to blur that out as well. Or maybe you just want to give the photo a sense of depth. So if you're taking a photo, sometimes you always don't get that sense of depth of the photo, and you just want to make it seem that the subject or the person standing in front makes it seem like they're very far, far away from the background. So all those are valid situations, in my opinion, that you would use background separation. Try not to over abuse the effect. It has a place and a purpose. And putting bokeh on a photo for the sake of bokeh, it really serves no purpose but to tell everyone that you're an amateur. All right? So just remember when and how you are using it. So with all these tips, I just want you to be aware that there's no bulletproof way to get a good photo. These are not hard and fast rules, but be creative and play around a bit to see what works. And I would like to thank you for watching or listening to this particular episode. For more of these videos, don't forget to like our Facebook page, subscribe to our YouTube channel using the icon in the top left corner, or follow us on Twitter. Please keep an eye out for part 2 of this mini-series, and I will be covering cell phone video and how to get better cell phone video. So thank you for joining me, and have a good afternoon, everyone.